We are extremely pleased to round off this series of Saturday lectures with a talk from a longtime friend of the Vedanta Society of New York and of the Vedanta family in general, Dr. Jeffery D. Long. Dr. Long is Professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. His graduate degrees are from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and his undergraduate degree is from the University of Notre Dame. He also studied for 2 years at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. In 2018, Dr. Long received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his efforts to help Americans understand Hinduism in academia and public schools. He's a longtime practitioner of Vedanta and the author of several books, including A Vision for Hinduism, Jainism, An Introduction, The Historical Dictionary of Hinduism, and his most recent book, Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, and it's published by Bloomsbury Publishing. The subject of his talk today is exploring Jain thought and practice. And I know that Dr. Long loves questions, so there will be time for that after his talk. Jeffery, as always, welcome.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. I always love presenting for the Vedanta Society of New York. I hope I can do it again in person at some point in the future, but it's great to join you all here from my home in Pennsylvania. So as Diane just said, our topic today is Jainism, Jain thought and practice. Most of you probably know the Jain tradition is you could say a cousin of Vedanta and of the wider Hindu tradition. It is distinct, but is at the same time has many overlaps and many interconnections with various Hindu traditions and also with Buddhism. And it is a tradition that's not particularly well known or well understood because the number of Jains is relatively small. Between 4 and 5 million is the global population of the Jain community. Nevertheless, it's a tradition that has had an enormous impact on religious life in India and on philosophy, and then subsequently global religious and philosophical life. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I have a presentation for you, which I originally presented a version of this for the San Francisco Museum of Asian Art a few years ago. So it's got a lot of visuals. So hopefully you will enjoy seeing those. And hopefully everyone's seeing my screen now. This is Exploring Jain Thought and Practice. I called this Peaceful Warriors. It's interesting. The Jain tradition has a very strong emphasis on ahinsa, that is nonviolence in thought, word, and action. Nevertheless, it uses a lot of military imagery and warrior imagery when talking about the spiritual life. The idea being that, like a warrior, one needs to engage in conquest, not of other people or beings or land or anything like that, but of oneself and of the negative impulses, the sanskaras that keep us tied to the cycle of rebirth. So the people who have attained enlightenment, awakening, and liberation, moksha, according to Jain teaching, are called jinna, which means conqueror. And so Jaina, which is the source of the word Jain or Jain, is someone who is an adherent of the path of the jinnas. So who are the jinnas? Who are the Jains? How did this tradition come to be? What are its teachings and practices? That's what we're going to explore today. So what is Jainism? It is an ancient spiritual path, one of the 4, we call them Dharma Traditions, originating on the Indian subcontinent alongside Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. It is also a vibrant and living tradition with a global following of approximately 4 to 5 million persons. Jains are best known for their profound commitment to nonviolence, illustrated here by the mupati or mouth shield worn by the sadhvis or nuns pictured here, who are from the Shvetambara Terapanthi tradition of Jainism. It's interesting, this mask wearing, of course, has now become a global practice because of the pandemic. And when we wear masks, it's to protect ourselves from the coronavirus, very tiny living thing, tiny microorganism, and also to protect others in case we're shedding these tiny microorganisms. One of the fascinating things about the Jain tradition, and I see this a lot with various Indian philosophical traditions, is that there was an awareness of the scientific reality of tiny, what we would now call microscopic life forms living in air and water. This awareness existed among the Jains for thousands of years, and this practice has similarly existed for a very, very long time. So those who do know something about Jainism, the first thing most people probably think of is this practice of very, very strict nonviolence, illustrated by monastic practices like this wearing of the mouth shield. So Jains are known for this, and also for the peacock feather whisk that is used to gently sweep the ground free from any tiny life forms that may be in one's path while walking, and to sweep any surface on which one may be about to sit. Jain monastic life is very, very strict, and practice ahinsa really dominates everything. So one has to be constantly mindful, constantly aware of where one is stepping, sitting, even lying down. If a Jain monk or nun is sleeping and they wake up enough to know that they need to turn over in their sleep, they have to sweep the space just to make sure they don't accidentally crush an insect, in case one would be there when they turn. So the symbols of this commitment to nonviolence are the mouth shield and the feather whisk. The feathers in the whisk are ones that are shed naturally by the peacocks. Again, nonviolence to all living things is important. So no one is out there, plucking peacock feathers from the poor peacocks. They fall naturally. They shed them, and then these are picked up and used for these whisks. So the central ethical principle of Jainism, again, is ahinsa, the absence of even the desire to harm any living being. So it is nonviolence in thought, in word, and in action. This is something that the Jains really emphasize to a very great extent in their teaching. Here you see an old photograph. This is back from the 19th century of Jain monks with they're wearing the mupati. They have the whisks. These aren't the peacock whisks, but it's a similar concept. So it's important to understand something about ahinsa. It is not simply a negative ethic of not doing harm. Some critics of the tradition have said, I think somewhat unfairly, that, well, it's all fine and well to not do harm, but what good are you doing to other beings? There was a Christian missionary named Margaret Sinclair Stevenson who wrote a book that was very harshly critical of Jainism in this respect, trying to argue that merely avoiding harm is not a positive ethic. But this is actually a distortion of Jain teaching. One consistently finds when interacting with Jains and also listening to Jain monks and nuns giving teaching, that it's a positive ethic of love for all beings, a wish to see all living beings live happily and thrive. So it's not only non-harming, but that really means willing the good for all beings, desiring the good for all beings. So this is really what ahinsa is all about. Pursuing the Jain path to its fullest extent requires one to take up a rigorously ascetic lifestyle, to become a Jain muni, a male Jain ascetic, what we might call a monk, or a sadhvi, that is a female Jain ascetic or Jain nun. However, because the Jain practices are so interesting, I think, to so many people, because they require such difficulty and such commitment, sometimes we focus on it a bit too much. An ordinary Jain is not an ascetic. An ordinary Jain is a householder, and in fact, the number of Jains who take up this path is actually relatively small. So out of the community of 4 to 5 million Jains, there are about 16,000 who are practicing monks and nuns. Which is a pretty decent proportion of the whole community, but it's still a small number compared to the total number of Jains. Most Jains are householders, laypersons with jobs, spouses, families, and so on, with a lifestyle that's not dramatically different from that of most Hindu families. Here's a photo of a Jain family. I found this on the internet. They have a business, and they have a picture of the family here. And as you can see, that they could be really just about any Indian family. Most lay Jains, though not all, are traditionally drawn to business professions. So that's also a popular image of Jainism, that the Jains are very involved in business. And there's some foundation for that. Again, not all Jains are in business, but the traditional career that they have taken up has been in the area of business, and they've on the whole been very successful in that area. This is one reason that Jains have, as a community, have had such an enormous influence on an Indian religion and culture, far beyond what their numbers might suggest. You say, oh, this is a very tiny community. You could compare the influence of Jainism, though, to tossing a pebble into a pond. The pebble might be very small, but pretty soon the ripples from that pebble, when it's tossed into the pond, are spreading throughout the entire pond. And so things like the Jain commitment to nonviolence, for example, this is something that has had a great deal of influence on other Indian schools of thought, on well-known figures like Mahatma Gandhi, for example. Jain laypersons have been great patrons of the arts through the centuries, with the construction of temples and sacred images being seen as a religiously meritorious act. So as you'll see later, there's some pictures of Jain temples, and you might expect a very ascetic kind of tradition like this that really focuses on withdrawing from material life to have very sparse temple facilities. But in fact, it's just the opposite. Some of the most magnificent temples actually in India have been Jain temples. So what do Jains believe? What is the Jain path? According to Jain teaching, the universe is filled with countless souls, jivas. The term jiva really means life or life force. This is often translated as soul by Jain teachers when they're explaining these things in English. It's basically the living essence of a being, right? And there are living beings filling the cosmos. So there are the living beings that we can see with bodies large enough to be visible to us, other human beings, animals, plants, and so on. But there are also jivas that are very, very tiny, or inhabiting bodies that are very, very tiny and microscopic, and they are filling the universe. Each jiva, each soul, possesses infinite awareness, infinite perception and knowledge, infinite bliss, and infinite energy. So this is very similar to in Advaita Vedanta, the teaching of the nature of Atman, nature of self, that it is Anantaram Satchidanandam, that is infinite being, infinite consciousness, infinite bliss. So in the Jain tradition, this is described as the four infinitudes, Ananta Chatushtaya, that is infinite awareness or perception, knowledge, bliss, and energy. So the basic concept of what the jiva is not really that different between Vedanta and the Jain tradition. I would say the biggest difference is that in Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, we emphasize the ultimate oneness of all of the jivas. The jivas appear to be many, but ultimately the Atman is one. In the Jain tradition, jivas have the same essence, but the distinctiveness of each jiva is actually what is emphasized. So there are countless jivas filling the cosmos. The pure nature of the soul, of the jiva, is obscured by karma, which according to Jain teaching is a form of subtle matter or energy that's drawn to the soul when the soul is disrupted by the kashayas, that is the passions. So the basic idea here is that the jiva in its original true nature is pure. You could compare it to maybe a very calm body of water, like you see here. It's calm, it's serene, and it's in its state of perfect joy. But because of the effects of karma, the jiva experiences something called the kashayas, that is the passions. So these are things like anger, greed, selfishness, delusion. These are things that attract these tiny subtle particles into the jiva, and they warp the nature of the jiva. They make, you could say, that this calm body of water very turbulent, right? So you see these waves here on the surface of the jiva. So these waves, these distortions, create something like, you could compare it to a magnetic field, which attracts the karma particles into the jiva. Now we're going to shift metaphors here. The karma particles, once they enter the soul, they can be compared to seeds. And this term is actually used in the Jain tradition, the bijas, the karma bijas. They become attracted to and embedded in the soul, in the jiva. And once there, rather like seeds planted in the soil, they have effects. Depending on the conditions of the soul, rather like the soil for a seed, the karma particle will eventually sprout, meaning it will create an experience. So in this metaphor, the seed is the karma particle, the soil is the jiva and its nature, the previous karma particles that have come into it, the effects they have had, and the sprouting of the seed, the plant coming up out of the soil in this metaphor, is an experience. So we have a happy experience or an unhappy experience. These experiences themselves evoke the kashayas, which attract more karma particles into the soul, and the entire process repeats. So you see, this is kind of a cycle that's been going on forever, according to Jain teaching. There's no origin story. There was no original sort of fall from grace or anything of that sort. It's simply a very natural process that has been going on forever, where we have experiences. We have these experiences because of our past actions. Those experiences result in the karmas coming into the soul, producing more experiences. We react to those experiences with some kind of attachment, right? That's what the kashayas really are. And that brings in more karma. And the whole process just goes on and on and on. So the aim of the Jain path is to end this process, to purify the jiva, to clean it out completely of karma and not draw in any more karma. And when that happens, the jiva experiences moksha. It experiences liberation, which is just the experience of the jiva in its true nature. All of these experiences that we're having as embodied beings, subject to happiness, unhappiness, illness, death, birth, rebirth, and so on. These are all karmic effects. The soul is something above and beyond all of that. So again, not unlike Vedanta, except you have this kind of almost physical explanation or aspect of karma there, that karma is an actual energy or substance that can adhere to the jiva and make it experience things. So the ultimate aim of Jain practice is to put an end to this process, to prevent further karmic seeds from entering the soul. This is done through the practice of equanimity, something called samayika, the calming of the passions. So if we calm the mind, if we calm the passions, if we accept our experiences with equanimity, being alike in joy and sorrow, just like the Bhagavad Gita says. In fact, there are even Jain thinkers who will cite the Bhagavad Gita in this regard. When we experience the state of equanimity, then we're not creating those magnetic waves, right? We're not attracting karma particles into the soul. So by practicing equanimity, one prevents this further influx of karma into the jiva. And there's actually a Jain meditative contemplative practice called samayika too, which serious Jains practice every day. It's a practice of meditation and contemplation. Lasts for about 48 minutes, what's called a muhurta, which is, of course, a very ancient time unit in all the Indian traditions. And so for each day, for the length of the muhurta, one practices samayika, and of course tries to maintain this state throughout the day. And one also tries to accelerate the burning off, the getting rid of karmic particles through ascetic practices such as fasting. Jains are very famous for the lengthy and rigorous fasts, which they will sometimes undertake. Both laypersons and ascetics will engage in such fasting. The idea behind asceticism is twofold. One, it's our attachment to certain things like food, for example, that prompts us to have these experiences that lead to more karma coming into the jiva. But there's also the idea that the fasting itself and the other kind of ascetic practices, the kinds of ascetic practices that one does, that these the discomfort associated with, if you will, on one's karmic debt. And so then one is able to more quickly get rid of the karmic particles that are already present. Jains share with Hindus and Buddhists the belief that karma leads to rebirth, or what's sometimes called in the West reincarnation, in a state and in a form appropriate to the karma one has accumulated. So, one accumulates various kinds of karmas, and these can lead to rebirth as any of the vast array of different kinds of life forms that exist. And so you could be a human being, you could be a horse, you could be a mouse, you could be a serpent, you could be a microscopic organism, you could be a deva, a divine being living in the heavenly realms. You could live in a hellish state if you have very, very bad karma, right? Karma that is the result of very, very heavy negative attachments. So this process is the basic idea here is something that we have in Vedanta as well. Freedom from the karmic process thus entails freedom from the cycle of karma and rebirth. So the ultimate aim of Jain practice is thus moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth through attaining nirvana, that is absorption in one's true nature or realization of the true nature of the soul. So again, all of this is very, very close to what we have in the Vedanta tradition. Like Buddhism, which has been deeply influenced by it, Jainism does not teach that the universe was created by a supreme deity who presides over the cosmos. The workings of karma are held to be sufficient to explain occurrences in the world and the orderly nature of events. So the Jains aren't invoking God as an explanation for anything in the universe. The process just has its own inner logic that unfolds. But it's not entirely correct to refer to Jainism as atheistic either, and I would say the same thing about Buddhism. The Jiva itself, in its pure nature, as infinite awareness, infinite bliss, and so on, is held to be divine. And divinity, therefore, is something that's present as a potential within all living beings. And of course, this is something that we teach in Vedanta as well, that all of us are potentially divine. To free oneself wholly from karma is, in effect, to become divine, to realize or manifest one's already always present divinity. Beings who have attained nirvana and moksha are known as jinnas or conquerors, meaning those who have conquered themselves. And the primary object of worship in Jain practice is these jinnas, these beings who have attained liberation. This is the source of the name, of course, Jaina or Jain, one who is an adherent of or follower or worshiper, devotee of the jinnas. Just as in the Hindu tradition, if you're a devotee of Vishnu, you're a Vaishnava. If you're a devotee of Shiva, you're a Shaiva. So if you're a devotee of the jinnas, you're a Jain. There have been many jinnas throughout cosmic time in our part of the universe. There's a complex model of both the physical and temporal aspects of reality in Jainism. There's a vast series of cosmic epochs. The universe is divided into different regions, and we live in a region where many jinnas have come. The universe goes through cycles, just as we see in the Hindu tradition. In each cosmic cycle, 24 special jinnas, known as Titankars or ford makers, appear in our world in order to show living beings a ford or crossing over the river of rebirth, samsara, to the further shore of moksha. Time, according to Jain teaching, is divided into, of course, cycles, and each cycle is further divided into subsets. So the picture here, you can see it looks a little bit like the face of a clock. And on the left side, you see there is the utsarpani. This is the ascending period of a cosmic cycle. And in this ascending period, things in the cosmos get better and better. Beings live for longer periods of time. They're experiencing a lot of happy, positive experiences. The downside of the Utsarpani is no one is attaining moksha during that period because they're all very happy doing what they're doing and living in the material world. So this reaches a peak that would correspond to the 12 noon part of the clock. And then it starts to descend. Things are still very, very happy for a long time. These cycles, by the way, we're talking about periods of billions of years. These are very, very long cycles. Slowly, though, things start to decline. Lifespans begin to decrease. Diseases emerge. Conflicts emerge among beings. And you enter a period of mixed happiness and unhappiness. And it's during this period that beings begin to aspire for moksha. They begin to realize that the positive things, the good things, the enjoyable things in the material world are only temporary, and there must be some higher peace, higher contentment, higher joy that is enduring and that is not dependent on the material world. So people begin to search for spirituality, and the Titankars begin to appear in our world. Things get worse and worse and worse. You have the dukkam kal, that is the unhappy period, and then the whole process starts again. Things start to get better, and this has just been the way of the universe forever, according to Jain teaching. The physical universe is also presented as being divided into various realms. This is called the lokakash, that is the realm of space that makes up the world. Space itself is infinite, and within infinite space there is the cosmos, and it's along a vertical axis. And this image of the universe is very closely connected with the idea of karma, because if you are near the bottom, right here you have Naraka, right, the abode of the hellish beings. This is where you have very heavy, very bad karma that has caused you to reborn in these really bad states. You have the middle realm. The middle realm is where human beings live. This is where it's easiest to get moksha, actually, because you have a balance of happiness and unhappiness. And then above you have the Devaloka. You have the abode of the various divine beings, who this would be people with very, very good karma, right? Jivas with very, very good karma. They'll be reborn in the Devaloka, and they'll enjoy happiness for millions of years in a divine form. But that's still not the full bliss and infinite joy of liberation. Once you've become liberated, once you are a jinna, you go to the Siddhashila, or the Siddhaloka, the abode of liberated beings, which is always depicted as being at the very top of the cosmos. This model of the cosmos, as you'll see, somewhat resembles the outline of the human form. And there may be some kind of ancient connection between this giant image of the universe and the image we see in the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, where the cosmos is made from the body of a giant being, the Purusha, the cosmic man. From that being come all the various other beings in the world. In the Vedic tradition and in Vedanta, this becomes an image for how Brahman, how the One, has become this whole universe. The Jains don't take it in that particular direction, but this concept has really inspired a lot of artwork. And you can see here just one sample. Here's another of the Loka Purusha, the cosmic man, the man who makes up the cosmos. And so each part of the body represents a different realm. So at the head, of course, you have the liberated realm. Further down, you get the hellish realms, and then the divine realms. And then right in the middle, of course, is the human realm, the cosmos that human beings inhabit, depicted as a flat disk with oceans and continents interspersed with one another. And our realm is one very small part of this, according to Jain teaching. Here is a very big model of this realm. If you go to Hastinapur in India, the old capital of the Kauravas back in the Mahabharata, but it's an actual town. You can go there today. There's a big Jain center there. According to Jain teaching, the first Tirthankara of our cosmic era, Adinath, or Rishabha as he is called, he undertook his monastic life, undertook his monastic vows in Hastinapur. So it's also been a Jain center of pilgrimage for many centuries. And there's a big Jain center there dedicated to the concept of the loka as it's presented in Jainism. And you see all of these models of the various realms. So this is a photograph of you could call it an aerial view of our middle realm in which we live. And all of these elements of this vast model have some symbolic meaning, some connection with the Jain stories of the Tirthankaras and their various past lives. They've lived all in various regions of the cosmos. This is a representation of the liberated realm. Here is the realm of the Jinnas. It's at the very top of there's a building at Hastinapur, and each story, each floor represents one of the levels of the cosmos in the Jain universe. And when you climb all the way up to the top, this is what you see. So again, 24 Tirthankars. It's not entirely clear why 24, but this is probably connected with the Jain calendar, which is very close to the Hindu calendar. There are 12 months of the year. It's a lunar calendar, and each month is divided into the Shukla Paksha, the Krishna Paksha, that is the bright and dark halves, that is when the moon is waxing or the moon is waning. So if you add up all of the Pakshas in the year, you get 24. And so if you think of the year as a kind of analog for cosmic time, then within our cosmic realm, within our epoch, if you divide it up into the Pakshas, each Paksha has its own Tirthankar. This is a statue of Adinath, the first Tirthankar who's undertaking his monastic path. This is also taken at a temple in Hastinapur. This huge image is of Bahubali. This is in Karnataka in southern India at a place called Shravanabagola. The story of Bahubali is quite fascinating. He is the son, actually, of Adinath, the first Tirthankara. But Bahubali actually was the first human being to attain liberation in our era, according to Jain teaching. He was a warrior. He was the brother of Bharata, who's, of course, the founder of Bharat, of India. And the two of them had a fight over who was going to control the realm. And they were rather than have their armies fight and have so much death and destruction, they decided to fight one-on-one. So they had a wrestling match and they were fighting, and Bahubali was winning. In fact, he lifted up his brother Bharat and he was about to crush him. He was about to smash him over his leg and break his back. And he suddenly realized, I'm about to murder my brother. For what? For land, for a kingdom. Of what value is this? What good is life going to be if I kill my own brother? So he gently set Bharata down on the ground and he stripped off all of his clothing and he just stood in meditation for days and days. Vines grew around his legs and arms, as you can see here. And eventually he attained the highest realization and became liberated. So this statue is really a marvel. It's about 56 feet tall and it's carved from a single rock. It's anointed every 10 years. There's a big anointing. You see that scaffolding that's built and sacred substances are poured over the statue. And this is a major event. And a lot of Jain householders will come to this event. They see it as a form of blessing. And a lot of this mix of sindoor and milk and yogurt is poured down over the image, and a lot of people have it. You see that it's sort of raining down on them, and it's a big celebration. And in fact, this particular photo is the cover of my book, which introduces Jainism. And I chose this photo because this is such a different image from that of the monks. With the face masks and so on, which is sort of a stereotype, you could say, of Jainism. For most Jains, it's a very celebratory tradition, a lot of festivals, worship, and so on. Bhakti is part of it, devotion to the Tirthankars. And so I wanted to capture that aspect of the tradition as well. There are stories of the lives of all the various Tirthankars. This is a very popular image. This is Parshvanath. He was the 23rd Tirthankar. And according to scholars, he was an actual historical figure. A lot of the Tirthankars, there's not much outside confirmation of their existence, but for Parshvanath there is. And he lived early in the first millennium BC. And here is Mahavira, the great hero, as his name means. This is the title he was given. His actual name was Vardhamana, but he was called Mahavira, the great hero. He lived at the same time as the Buddha, around the 6th century BC, and is really he's the last Tirthankara of our era. And you could sort of think of him as the founder of Jainism, though most Jains will tell you he's not really the founder in the sense of originating the tradition, because he's the 24th Tirthankara, and there were others before him. And again, Parshvanath almost certainly was also a historical figure, and Mahavira was building on his tradition. Though he's not technically the founder of Jainism, according to Jain tradition, as well as based on the scholarly determination that he inherited and reformed a pre-existing tradition, Mahavira can be seen as the founder of the Jain community as it exists today. Born Vardhamana Gyatriputra, Mahavira lived, according to traditional Jain sources, from 599 to 527 BCE. Recent scholarship suggests his dates may actually be 100 years later. There's a big debate about this. We know that Mahavira and the Buddha overlapped in time. They mention one another in the respective scriptures of the two traditions. There's no evidence that they ever met, but they were aware of one another. They lived around the same region of India, what's now the Bihar, Bengal, Eastern Uttar Pradesh region. So they were aware of one another. They wandered and traveled in the same areas. And there's a lot of debate about when the Buddha lived, and various archaeological and textual discoveries that have sort of pushed his lifetime into a more recent century. And so that would pull Mahavira along as well, because we know they lived around the same time. So as I say here, he was a contemporary of the Buddha, who many scholars would argue lived from 490 to 410 BC. So that might put Vardhamana in the 5th century BC. But this is all debated and becomes very technical. Interesting things about Jain history. It might have connections with the ancient Indus Valley civilization. There are some resemblances between Jain motifs and artwork and things that you can see in the Indus Valley. The Jinnas, again, they're often depicted, as you see here, with these very, very long arms extending almost down to the knees. There are a lot of images like this from the Indus Valley civilization. So you can see the comparison there, for example. All the evidence we have suggests that the Indus civilization was very, very peaceful. And so many Jains will argue, well, maybe its foundation was ahinsa, same as the Jain tradition. There is also an interesting connection with the Hindu deity Shiva, who there are various depictions in the Indus Valley that some have argued resemble the Hindu deity Shiva. Some have disputed that as well. But you see some of these images, and there are also resemblances between depictions of Shiva and depictions of Adinath, the first Jain Titankar. And so there are some who have argued that these are both representations of some original shared historic figure who was of religious importance, maybe a founding figure in the Indus Valley civilization. Everything about the Indus civilization, or most of what we know about it, is very speculative, because we don't yet know how to read its script. But these are speculations people have engaged in. This is one of the very famous Indus seals that some have argued resembles Hindu deity Shiva. Here are Shaiva monks. These are Naga Babas. These are naked Shaiva monks. They practice very serious asceticism. And in many respects, their lifestyle resembles that of the Digambara Jain monks, who also don't wear any clothing as a symbol of their detachment. And so, again, there's a possibility that these two have sprouted from some common root. We're on firmer historical ground when we get to the period of Mahavira and the Buddha. They were both part of a movement called the Shramana movement. Shramana means one who strives, a striver. These Shramanas differentiated themselves from the other major religious experts of the first millennia BC. That's, of course, the Brahmanas, the Brahmins. And they argued, the Shramanas argued, that sacred knowledge should be available to everyone, and that through one's own individual striving, rather than through rebirth as a Brahmin, one could attain to liberation. And so they were both part of this broader movement that existed in the first millennium BC. And it's been seen by some as a kind of Hindu reform movement, which eventually led to these two traditions becoming distinct traditions of their own. When you get into the period of the Maurya dynasty, the Maurya Empire, the Shramana traditions were very popular under that dynasty. They all, there was the Jain tradition, there was Buddhism, there was another tradition called the Ajivika tradition, which eventually became extinct. But these all thrived under the patronage of Maurya emperors. Most of you have probably heard of the Emperor Ashoka, the third Maurya emperor, who was a big patron of Buddhism. His father, Bindusara, was a patron of the Ajivika tradition, and his grandfather, the founder of the Maurya dynasty, Chandragupta Maurya, was a Jain by all the accounts that we have. The Maurya Empire lasted from about 320 to 184 BCE. Around the time the Maurya Empire went into decline, it was struck by a famine that led to a division of the Jain community. One group of Jains had already traveled west. The center or the heartland of Jainism is, like I said, around what's now Bihar. In ancient times, the city of Pataliputra, which was the capital of the Maurya dynasty. But when the famine hit, there were Jains who, some had already migrated to Mathura in Western India, and because of the famine, they migrated further west into what are now the states of Gujarat and Rajasthan. So those are major Jain centers today. Another group traveled south into what is now Karnataka, where the big Bahubali statue is that I showed you. And by about 200 AD or CE, these groups had divided into two distinct types of Jain practitioners, the Shvetambaras and the Digambaras. Shvetambaras being more prominent in the north and Digambaras more prominent in the south, though there's a northern Digambara movement also. If you look at the murtis, the images used by Digambaras and Shvetambaras, the Shvetambara image here is on the right, and you see it's adorned. The eyes are open. There are sort of jewels along the body that symbolize Mahavira's spiritual achievements. The Digambara Murti is completely unadorned, completely plain. Similarly, the monks in the Shvetambara tradition wear simple white robes, but as we've already mentioned, the Digambara monks don't wear anything at all, right? So they have different interpretations of the level of simplicity and detachment that one has to actually physically show in practice. Throughout the first millennium of the Common Era, a large number of really magnificent Jain temples were built. So you find a lot of these in Gujarat and Rajasthan and Karnataka and various other places in India as well. This is Mount Abu, which is a very important Jain pilgrimage center. Pilgrimage or yatra is as important in Jainism as in Hindu traditions. The places of pilgrimage are all places associated with events in the lives of the Titankars, their birth, their attaining of nirvana, their final passing away, their initiation into monkhood, and so on. And this is still a living tradition. These are some photos from a Jain temple in New Delhi that was under construction when I taught in a Jain summer school in Delhi back in 2011. And the Shilpis, the people who were making these carvings, they let me take some photos of them while they were working. And you can see, I mean, this is a modern work, right? This is 2011, but it looks just like what you see on some of the ancient temples. So this is that temple in Delhi. You can still see it's still under partial construction at this time. There's still some scaffolding up and some work being done, but it was already being used for worship by people in the community. And again, you see the same sort of dedication to detail, the really beautiful artwork. I might be skipping through these too quickly, but I'm mindful of the time today as I'm speaking. But this gives you a little bit of a feel for the lived Jain tradition and its artwork and how it has expressed itself. I'm very fond of this particular image. This is, of course, an elephant. The Jains are very fond of course, the famous story of the blind men and the elephant, which represents the diversity of perspectives, that we all have different views of ultimate reality. Yet it is the same ultimate reality that we're all ultimately in contact with. The Jains also believe this. They call it anekantavada. That is the doctrine of the teaching of many facets of existence, of pluralism. And so this was something that really was one of the things that attracted me to studying Jainism, because, of course, coming from the Ramakrishna tradition and from Vedanta, the diversity of paths to truth is of course, a major theme of Thakur's life and teaching as well. So you see a connection and a commonality between Vedanta and Jainism, while there are also many interesting distinctions and a lot of aspects of the Jain worldview that are quite unique to it. So that's my basic presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I know it looks like there's some questions in the chat. Diane, do you want to, or Prakyat, do you want to?
So you can ask questions in the chat, or you can also just unmute yourself. So I'll get started with the questions in the chat. Rita has a couple of comments. Simply amazing to find the word kashaya in Jain thought. It was mentioned as an obstacle in Vedanta Sara. Also, the concept of magnetic attraction was discussed in reference to Sri Ramakrishna's metaphor of a clean needle being able to attract the divine.
Yes, you see a lot of similarities, and my sense of these two traditions, the Vedanta tradition and the Jain tradition, is they're rooted in many of the same experiences. And of course, they might use slightly different theory to describe and put that experience into a philosophical form. But you can see, like this, the kashayas, right, are definitely a real thing because we experience them from day to day. We have frustrations, we have things that make us angry, we have all of our various attachments, and then we're working and struggling with that. And this is discussed in Vedanta and in Jainism. And yes, this sort of magnetic attraction, the idea that we need to purify our own mind, purify our own consciousness, so that the deeper divine reality within can shine through.
Sangeeta?
Hello, namaste, Professor Long. Nice to see you.
Namaste, Sangeeta. Good to see you again after a long time.
I know. Fabulous presentation. And as a person who is just beginning to study Jainism, though I think I should have done it earlier, given that my husband's family is Jain, I have a basic question for you. If you could please go back to that slide which had Shvetambara and the Digambara Murtis next to each other.
Sure. Okay. Yes. Is that, let's see, is the slideshow visible?
Yes, yeah.
And I want to go to that particular slide. Let's see, further down.
Yeah. It's the one where, one was adorned with an open eyes and the other was not.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So right. So my question here is, I notice it says Sri Arinath Bhagwan in the left,
yes,
and right is Mahavira. So I'm not able to reconcile why would we have Digambara as Aranath, because Aranath seems to be the 13th Kamadeva as well. And, to my lay mind, when I'm trying to reconcile what Digambara is about, not having any attachment to the body and more extreme form of renunciation, how would that, get associated with the 13th Kamadeva?
Well, that's extremely interesting. And I think it may simply be coincidental, right? It might be the same name, but two different traditions, two different beings being described. However, I know that there's a lot of interweaving among the traditions. There are situations where Jains, for example, very often will participate in Hindu religious festivals, the worship of Hindu deities, and so on. And if you look at the Jain history, some scholars call it the universal history. It's a vast series of interconnected stories that go over many lifetimes and many different cosmic epochs. And some of the Hindu deities, according to the Jain account, are later reborn as Titankars. And so it could be this, you've actually asked a question that I have not personally researched, and it's something I'd like to look into. It may be that there is a connection. In fact, I suspect it's not simply a coincidence, because that's rarely the case in these traditions. Usually these things are thought through very deeply. So it could be that Aranath is the Kamadeva after he has become liberated. Possibly. I mean, that might be the interpretation, but I can't say that with certainty before I would research that more deeply. Since you asked me to bring these slides up again, I just want to quickly mention something else that's I think important as well. Though these are a Digambara and a Shvetambara Murti, they are in the same mandir. This is from a Jain temple in Michigan, Troy, Michigan, here in the U.S. And the Jain community in the U.S. has really made a great effort to overcome sectarian divisions. There are differences among Jains. Shvetambara and Digambara are the best known of the two. They're the two main sects. But one of the things that has been done in worship facilities is to accommodate both traditions. And so there's a gallery in this mandir of all 24 Titankars, and the 18th here, Aranath, is depicted as in the Digambara manner. And then you come to Mahavira, the 24th, and he's depicted in the Shvetambara manner. And if you go through the entire 24, you'll find they're sort of interspersed with one another. So that's one way that the communities have accommodated each other. But no, you've raised a really good question, because I never really thought about that name being the same. It might be deliberate, and so that's something I would want to look into, but I don't know actually. It could be a coincidence.
Thank you.
Mr. Krishan is asking, can you please share the significance of the snake and rope board game that you showed in one of the past slides?
Yes, that's very significant because that game, Snakes and Ladders, is very, very popular in India, and there's an American version called Chutes and Ladders, and the basic concept is you're trying to make your way across through the game board, and if you do good deeds, you advance. If you do bad deeds or neglect to do good deeds, you fall. And this is a way of teaching children about karma and rebirth, so that if we do good, we'll advance. If we fail to do good or we do bad, we fall, we regress. And so and the Jain model of the universe, actually, the way I understand it is that it's like a vast game of snakes and ladders, right? That is the nature of existence. There's been some debate in the contemporary era about how literally Jain should take the traditional Jain model of the universe, because obviously the Earth is not a giant flat disk, and so on, and so people debate these things a bit. And I would see it as a depiction of the universe from a karmic perspective, right? That the various realms represent the various experiences one has as a result of living in a certain way. So that's the significance of that. That game actually originated as a way to teach children about the cycle of rebirth. Whether the game originated with the Jains or with the Hindus, I'm not entirely sure, but it's been very popular among both communities.
Professor, there's a question from Rita. Can you please elaborate on the role of fasting? This is also a common practice in the followers of Ekadashi, where Ekadashi is Devi, who springs from the Sukshma Sharir to wake up Vishnu. And
yes,
she has a follow-up. In the aspect of fasting, where the Jains influenced by the Siddhas, or is it vice versa? Siddhas are supposed to be even earlier than the Indus Valley civilization.
That's right. So fasting from the Jain perspective is undertaken in order to do several things. One, it's reducing attachment, because of course tasty food is an object of attachment. So when we fast, we take control over that attachment. Secondly, it's a practice of ahinsa, because even if you eat a very strict, very prescribed Jain vegetarian diet, according to the Jain teaching, the very act of eating and digestion involves violence, because there are microorganisms in the food, there are microorganisms in the physical body. And so to engage in fasting is to refrain for a little while from doing that particular form of harm, which we do by necessity as long as we're embodied in these forms. And then again, the third aspect is that the difficulty of the fasting is seen as sort of burning off karma, right? So it has those three aspects. So this is, of course, fasting. There are various traditions of fasting in the Hindu tradition as well. Ekadashi is a very, the 11th day of the month it's a very important day for fasting, as Rita has said. In terms of where it came from, pardon me, I'm taking my quick drink of tea here. Whether it started with the Jains or with the Siddhas first is, I think, very difficult to tell from a purely scholarly or historical perspective. As Rita says, Siddhas are supposed to be even earlier than the Indus Valley civilization, and the Jains would claim that the Jain tradition is also, right, that it is eternal, that this tradition has always existed. So in terms of which came first or which influenced the other, very difficult to say. We don't have enough evidence really to say for sure. And in fact, as a scholar, my inclination is to say that it's likely that they both originate from a common source, that for various contingent reasons got split into two traditions.
Professor Bill is asking, can you please comment on the Jain practice of gradually fasting onto death by slowly reducing one's food?
Yes, this is one of the most controversial Jain practices. It's called Salekana or Santara, and rather like conventional fasting, it is seen as an act of detachment and an act of nonviolence, but of course a very radical one, because one fasts until the physical body dies. Now, something very interesting needs to be pointed out here. Right away, people will often object to this practice. They'll say, isn't that a form of violence? Isn't that suicide? From a Jain point of view, Salekanara Santara is something that can only be undertaken when one has attained a state of total detachment. So suicide is something that one does out of great passion, right? Because of the Kashayas. You're so sad or angry or upset about some external condition that you want to end your life. And from a Jain point of view, that's a very bad thing, right? All traditions say, don't commit suicide, right? It is typically seen as a form of violence. But if one has reached a state of realization in which there is no further attachment to the body, there's a sense that preserving the body is just going to continue doing violence to small life forms, and you're ready to renounce it, then that is seen as a very profoundly spiritual act. And there's a wonderful story that illustrates this. There's a Jain saint called Samantabhadra, and he lived, we think, around the 5th or 6th century AD. And he contracted leprosy, which of course is a horrible disease. And he was very understandably upset by this. So he went to his guru and he said, I want to undertake the fast to death. And his guru said, no, yet I will not permit you to do that. You have to get the permission of your guru in order to undertake this fast. Samantabhadra said, why will you not give me permission? The guru said, you've not achieved detachment. You will be reborn in one of the hells if you undertake this right now. You're just upset because you got leprosy. So he said, you need to go and meditate, fast, not to the death, but, in the conventional sense, do spiritual practice, do sadhana for a year, and then let's have this conversation again. So Samantabhadra went and practiced for a year as his master taught him. Then he came back to his guru, and his guru said, so how do you feel now about Salekana? Do you still want to do this? And Samantabhadra said, it's in your hands. He says, I've been meditating and practicing. I've realized I am not this body. I am the Jiva, which is eternal. Whether this body lives or dies is of no consequence to me. So you tell me. I will fast if you say I should, or I will not if you say not. But I'm indifferent. And the guru said, now you're ready to undertake the fast, right? So that's the idea, that it is the ultimate practice of detachment. In actual practice, it's usually undertaken by very elderly monks and nuns who've reached a state where they can no longer physically live the lifestyle of a Jain monk or nun. It becomes too difficult for them to physically do the things they need to do in order to follow their practice, because it is a very physically and mentally demanding practice. So when they can no longer do that, they say, okay, now I'm ready to give up the body. The body is, outlived its usefulness. There have been some controversial cases in India where younger people undertook the fast, and the police actually got involved because there was a question of whether they were really doing this out of a genuine spiritual aspiration, or were they being pressured because somebody wanted to inherit something. And so it really became a very controversial court case in India, because the government basically stepped in to what could be seen as a religious practice and situation, and basically banned it, except under very, very specific circumstances, essentially saying, this is not a practice for young people.
Professor, what is the Jain view of other Dharma traditions? Did they participate in philosophical debates like the Buddhists did?
Yes, they did, very extensively, in fact. And so on the one hand, the Jains have the view that, they're, like I mentioned, anikantavada, the idea that there are many perspectives, there are many ways to approach the truth. But like all philosophical schools, the Jains believed that their particular view was the most complete, the most comprehensive. So they would be willing to say that other schools of thought, Vedanta, Sankhya, Yoga, Buddhism, they would say they're partially correct. They would say they have an insight into this particular aspect of reality. But then there was the critical side as well, where they would say, but that needs to be supplemented further with these other perspectives and so on. But yes, they engaged extensively in philosophical debate. They were very much part of that whole classical period discussion. And this kind of ambivalent attitude where, they would see something positive in another tradition, but then also be critical of it. You see this coming right up to the contemporary period. And one of the most interesting, I think, Jain thinkers was Yashovijaya, a relatively recent figure. He lived in the 18th century, but he studied Hindu sources extensively. He studied the Navya Nyaya, the New Logic school of thought, and he actually would cite the Bhagavad Gita, for example. I mentioned the idea of being alike in joy and sorrow, for example. He would cite Hindu sources approvingly, right? Not as objects of criticism, but as valid sources of knowledge. So, and interestingly, in terms of Buddhism as well, Jains were equally critical of Buddhism, but they also had a very deep respect for the Buddha himself, and they always referred to him as Sugata, which means the one who has gone, who has lived well, right? And so the idea of seeing the positive side of another tradition, this is seen by many Jains today as an intellectual form of the practice of ahinsa, where you don't simply say the other person is wrong and stupid and bad and so on, but you find the truth in their perspective. But the Jains have also been very conscientious in wanting to advance their particular understanding of reality. So I wouldn't call them total relativists. They definitely had a perspective they wanted to advance.
So, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely. Be happy to.
Sangeeta is asking, could you kindly comment more on the practice structure of mental ahimsa or non-violence at the level of thought itself in Jain philosophy?
Yes. In fact, this is the most important level of ahinsa, right? So ahinsa, again, is non-violence in thought, word, and action. I always find simply translating it as non-violence to be inadequate, because in the Western world, we think of non-violence, we think of basically not doing physical harm to others. That should hopefully be fairly easy. I mean, certainly with other human beings, right? If we're not out, fighting and killing all the time, that's not seen as such a great ethical accomplishment. It's really kind of the minimum, right? To not be doing that. But the root of every violent act is a violent thought or a violent desire. And that is the level at which the spiritual conquest, as it were, has to occur, where we uproot even any kind of negative thought, anger that would, there's such a thing as righteous anger, right? Where you see something wrong and you need to fix it, and you use that energy to do something positive. Gandhi was very strongly influenced by Jainism in that regard. But to actually desire another living being to come to harm, to want someone to feel pain, this is the root of all bad karma, basically, because then we attract that very same thing to ourselves. And so the practice of mental nonviolence, mental ahimsa, is the most important one. And as you've seen, it's a very strict tradition. If you take all the Jain rules very seriously, the ultimate end would be the fasting to the death, right? But this is not what most Jains do. And in fact, I was on a Zoom seminar, a webinar just a couple of days ago, and there was a young Jain woman, American Jain, families from India. And she talked about the various ways in which she calls herself a modern Jain. And she was saying there's some ways that it's just physically impossible to practice some of these things. And so there are compromises that people make. But that if you keep the core idea at the center, right, this uprooting of violence from one's own consciousness, then that makes it easier to then put the other things in practice. And so that was something that was discussed there. Well, there are two Jain meditative practices that are useful in this. Well, I mean, nonviolence itself is seen by many Jains as a form of mindfulness, because avoiding stepping on insects and that sort of thing, that involves being very aware of one's physical environment. But there is samayika, which I mentioned, the 48-minute session where one is practicing serenity, and that also involves several different prostrations and recitations from Jain texts and so on. There's another practice called praksha, which is basically meditation. It's more or less like what we do in the Vedanta tradition, calming the mind, calming the thoughts, withdrawing attention from the sensory realm. And both of those are also used to reinforce the idea of ahinsa, because when you're in that state of complete mental calm, you're not wishing any harm to any living thing. You're not angry. You know, the kashayas are all calm. So those practices are very important.
So, Jeffrey, thank you. This was a wonderful talk, very instructive, and as usual, very stimulating. And it's always a joy to have you speak to us. I, for one, would want to hear more about this subject. It's just fascinating to me, anyway. In any event, we hope to see you in the fall in person. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful summer. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And it is always an honor and a pleasure to speak with the Vedanta Society of New York. It's great to see all of you. And yes, look forward to the time we can be together in person. And because you mentioned wanting to hear more, a voice in my head is saying this is where I should plug my book. So yeah, Jainism, an introduction, and it's available in paperback and online, I believe, too. So that would be another place to look. And hopefully that's just the beginning. There are many other good books on Jainism that have been written. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you. Stay well.
Thank you. You too.